In this lecture, we'll be exploring a completely new topic within the area of developmental psychology. In particular, we'll be looking at emotional development. But to understand why we're covering this, I'm going to provide us with kind of a refresher of how we've navigated throughout this class and give you a little context as to where we're going with this topic. As we mentioned in the very beginning of this class, we have a multitude of different ways that we can try to talk about lifespan development. We could potentially cover everything from birth all the way to death and a couple of the things in between and, well, on the other ends. But that particular approach to talking about lifespan development can sometimes make the material a bit choppy and kind of chaotic. So what I did in this particular class was take the same approach as a number of other lifespan development classes, and that's approach the lifespan through what we call the modular approach, where we break up the changes and development that happen throughout the lifespan into different categories. In particular, we've already looked at the physical or biological changes that occur throughout lifespan in the first portion of the class. We then, in the last portion, transition to talking about the cognitive, mental changes that take place as we go throughout our lifespan. And in this last section, what we're going to be doing now is turning our attention to what we call socio-emotional based lifespan development. In essence, we're going to look at how we change in the social world, emotional world, and all the things related to it as we progress from infancy into adulthood across kind of a variety of different realms. When we talk about socio-emotional processes, there's actually a lot of different ways we can go, kind of like cognitive psychology. We can talk about something that's kind of inherent within the name, emotional development, which is exactly what we're going to be doing in this lecture, but there's a lot of things that spring off of that. In the second lecture in this particular module, we're going to be looking at changes in attachment and temperament. Two things that definitely fit under the umbrella of what we call emotional development. That also leads us to something very closely linked to that we call personality and identity development. In that lecture, that area, we're going to be exploring major theories to personality identity and how those things unravel throughout the lifespan. Once we get past those key elements, things get a little bit more complicated. There's lots of areas that we could potentially explore that fit under the realm of socio-emotional processes, but we have to kind of pick two. So for this particular class, we're going to be talking, after we talk about personality and identity development, about sexuality and gender identity development. We're going to be looking at kind of the classic theories and ideas that were first brought up when we started talking about how these things might relate to development. And then we'll transition to some more research-based, more logical, intuitive, and also kind of current ideas that have been addressed when looking at the topics of gender and sexuality and how these things emerge throughout our lifespan. And after that, we're going to be looking at another controversial topic when we talk about moral and sometimes, oftentimes actually tied to what's called spiritual development. You might notice in the text that the book focuses a little bit more on the spiritual side of things, and in class I'm going to focus a little bit more on the moral side of things, but I'm not going to get into that differentiation too much now. Just understand that that's going to be the last area that we're going to address as we try to tackle this huge mountain of what we call socio-emotional processes over the next 4 modules. In this particular lecture, what we're going to be doing is looking at a topic that's really within the name of socio-emotional growth, and it's this topic of what we call emotions. Now, before we get into how emotions can change and some of the different topics within emotional development that we can explore, I want to first just define what an emotion is, because there's often a lot of misnomers out there, and in fact there's a lot of people that have this propensity to believe that emotions aren't really a component of the mind. They're just some socially contrived thing. Psychologists who study the mind and study the body definitely do not align with that philosophy. If we're looking for a definition of emotions, you'll find a variety of different ones talking about the utility of emotions or the things that are happening when we experience an emotion or the social constraints around emotions. But to try to kind of narrow things down, I went with kind of the classic textbook definition of emotions that you'll find in a number of different resources that focuses on the psycho and physiological changes that occur when we're interacting with our environments. Essentially, emotions are things that are theoretically evoked by what we're experiencing. But that's, as we'll talk about later, just the tip of the iceberg. We do understand that emotions, when evoked in situations, do usually help us in social interactions, and over our lifespan tend to have a very strong impact on bonds. It also is the thing that tends to sever bonds when other types of emotions can pop up. And when we're talking about the formation and severance of bonds, we get into a really critical aspect to emotions, and that's the fact that there are a variety of them, and separating them out, categorizing them, is one of the first things that emotion researchers like to do. So one of the ways that we separate out emotions is by talking about them as either positive or negative invariance. Pretty much every emotion we have, at least most of the ones that we're going to be talking about in this class, tend to have the ability to be categorized as good, positive emotions or negative, bad emotions. It's not that we shouldn't have the bad emotions, it's just, well, we don't feel good when we're experiencing them. The only particular emotion that doesn't quite fit into that definition is an emotion we're going to be talking about a couple times in this class called surprise. A lot of people have actually started to call surprise kind of a precursor emotion, where something's happened, we know we're going to want to respond to it, but we don't quite know how we feel about it. It's definitely, we think, something that's unique and discrete. It's just how we categorize it is something that's still a bit of a debate. We also see, as we talked about earlier, that these particular emotions that can fit into a bunch of categories can impact our arousal levels in different ways as well. Some of them kind of calm us, subdue us. A great example of this could be something like bliss or sadness. There are others that, on the other hand, alert us, get us kind of awoken from the situation that we're in. Anger is a classic example of this, but so is happiness. Bliss and happiness might sound alike, but the way they get us alert in different ways has led some emotion researchers to kind of differentiate between those two. And you'll see these types of tweaks and qualifications made all the time when we look at different types of emotions that could potentially exist and how we define them and how they might impact our behaviors in different situations. In this class, we're not going to spend a ton of time looking at the more nuanced emotions that can pop up in adulthood, but we will talk about the fact that these things tend to be related to not only kind of different categories and how they impact us, but also how they change our bodies, how they impact our physiological reactions to the world around us, and the behaviors that our bodies elicit when we feel specific emotions. But it's kind of interesting to note that many researchers studying emotions argue very strongly, vehemently, that this is a two-way street. So not only do our emotions impact our physiological changes and behaviors, but our behaviors do tend to impact our emotions, as do our changes in physiology. That's a complicated topic, but we are going to kind of look at it on the basic level, and in doing so, hopefully we'll kind of illuminate how something as complex like this can start to emerge throughout our lifespan. We're going to look at what allows this to happen. We should first focus our attention on which systems are really critical players in the emergence of emotions and the differentiation of the emotions that we just talked about. There has been considerable research to highlight that emotions, as I mentioned before, are not just something that we're coming up with out of thin air. Emotions have sources. In fact, there have been many researchers since neuroscience started to evolve that have tried to trace specific emotional reactions to different areas of the brain and patterns of activity in the brain. We've actually been very successful at this over the years. We've talked about some of the key players in emotions earlier. We've talked about the amygdala, structure that's part of something called the limbic system, being the house to lots of different emotions. Usually when we talk about the amygdala, we focus on negative emotions like sadness and fear, but there's other structures that are linked to emotions outside of the hippocampus as well. the amygdala as well. I mentioned just one of them there, the hippocampus, an area that's typically tied to memory, has also been tied to other types of emotions and of our ability to tend to which types of emotions we think we're feeling in a specific situation. This also leads us to another critical structure called the frontal lobe. In particular, there's an area in the front of our frontal lobe called the prefrontal cortex that seems to be a huge player in our assessment of the situation and our assessment of the specific emotions we're feeling. This is kind of the simplistic view of emotions that we've tackled before and will probably lean on for the majority of this particular class. But also understand that there are other elements to our emotional experience going on inside of the brain. This topic of what's called the modularity of emotions is something that is extensively explored by lots of neuroscientists these days, and they've tied other areas that aren't pictured here to specific emotions. One of my favorite is called the nucleus accumbens, which is actually pretty close to the amygdala. It's a tiny structure that is been tied to both addiction and happiness. Essentially, what we see is that when we're feeling lots of fear and other strong emotions, the amygdala tends to trigger a cascade of behaviors that tells us we're scared. In situations where we're happy or we're really enjoying something, the nucleus accumbens seems to fire off a whole bunch of different responses that creates this cascade of behavior in the brain that eventually leads us to conclude we're feeling pretty good. And this is just two of the different areas where emotions tend to be kind of sourced from. If we want to understand how our body changes, well, then we actually have to work our way down. There's a structure that's actually connected to the amygdala and hippocampus. It's kind of a part of the limbic system called the hypothalamus. And this particular area creates a huge number of different reactions, both within our nervous system and another system that we call our endocrine system, that can activate two different physiological types of responses when we experience emotions, what's called the sympathetic nervous system response and the parasympathetic nervous system response. You might know them better as the fight or flight response and the rest and digest response. We know that there's lots of mechanisms connected to this hypothalamus that sends out nervous system responses to the heart, to the lungs, to our blood vessels that allow us to kind of have a more appropriate reactions to the situations that we find ourselves in that we think are pretty emotionally dictated. Um, if we want to go even closer into this, we can recognize that there are usually pathways through the spinal cord that send out these messages to the body. There's one exception to this called the vagus nerve that has been very enticing to researchers over the last decade or two. And that's because this vagus nerve is actually a nerve that travels pretty much from the hypothalamus to the body directly, and it seems to be linked to parasympathetic nervous system responses. Now, what makes it even cooler is that there is varying degrees of vagus nerve activity from person to person when they're experiencing emotions. Essentially, they must have very active vagus nerves, while others don't have a very active vagus nerve. And this variation has been tied to things that we'll talk about later, like emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize what we're feeling in specific times, and even the ability to kind of calm ourselves in different situations. All of these things really highlight how, again, emotions are not just these hypothetical things that we're looking at. They've got complexity to them, and there are neurological sources to these things that we want to be mindful of, and that will pop up as we talk about progressing from infancy into adulthood when it comes to changes that we see with respect to emotions. So how do we develop emotionally then? What allows us to actually become more complex adults as we kind of compare us to our infant persons? And what we tend to see is that we start to do to we do start to express, more types of emotions as we get older, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg. We do first need to become a little bit more in touch with the emotions that we're feeling. And we also need to become in touch with the emotions that others are feeling. And once we do that, we start to have the ability to control our reactions that link up to our emotions and potentially even alter our emotions to an extent. This leads us to the ability to kind of appropriately react in situations to elicit emotions in others, or kind of appropriately react in situations when we don't want our emotions to show. Essentially, emotions very importantly dictate a lot of our behaviors and situations, but eventually, as we develop, we recognize the imperative nature of kind of having our emotions also matching up appropriately with the situations we find ourselves in. We're going to talk about kind of how we develop from infancy into adulthood, but it's important to note here that there is going to be a great range of differences from person to person by the time we get to adulthood. What's even interesting is that we all pretty much start in the same place when it comes to emotions. And understand this same place we start from, I'm going to first allude to a theorist that was talking about emotions long before we had some of our current understanding of what emotions entailed and how they work. It's a very famous theorist in emotional research named Louis Goldberg, who actually was building off of the ideas of somebody you might have heard of before, a gentleman named Charles Darwin. Now, Goldberg's name might not have rung a bell, but when I said Darwin, my guess was that you probably immediately went to your kind of old high school or college years when you started learning about this theorist who talked about evolution and the emergence of specific behaviors and things that are sticking with us if they had utility. Well, Darwin actually was one of the first people to suggest that there might be some evolutionary benefits to having emotions. Louis Goldberg took this idea a little bit further and said, well, if there's value to these things, then we probably don't have all of our emotions prepackaged within us, but there probably are a couple that are just biologically inherent because they provide us with some specific value. If we're looking for these, what he called discrete emotions, biologically inevitable emotions, is that there should be some kind of telltale signs that we're looking at not just a random emotion, but something that's truly discrete, essentially inherited. One of the first things he said we should be looking for is an emotion that emerges early in life. Not necessarily right at birth, since there's a lot of programming that still has to happen from birth to infancy and into childhood, but pretty darn early on. He also suggested that these things should be universal across cultures. So we shouldn't just see this, say, in Western culture and nowhere else. We should see the emergence of these specific emotions if they're truly universal across all groups. And if we're looking at these things, we don't just want to say, yeah, everybody's saying they're sort of feeling it. We want to see some type of biological signature. Now, Goldberg didn't necessarily at the time have the ability to tap into our brains and look for neurological responses that were similar across people, across cultures. But what he did have the ability to do was look at our faces, look at whether or not we had pretty much the same muscles twitch when we felt specific types of emotions. Like Goldberg had a whole series of studies, which I thought were really amazing, where he actually traveled across multiple cultures, giving people hypothetical scenarios and asking them what they would feel, not by asking them to say what they would feel, but just express their emotion in these hypothetical scenarios that he would present to see if everybody would react to the situations in the same way. Now, did he find discrete emotions? We're going to leave this for a little bit later. But just understand that this idea of having pre-programmed emotions within us was something that was really in the infancy years of emotion research, and it led us to studying infants looking for these pre when talking about early emotions is that it's tough to differentiate between whether or not we have emotions or we're just expressing stuff that eventually evolves into motions. Because most people, when looking at infants, tend to focus on what we call emotion behaviors, things that probably are indicating a child's feeling and emotion, but the complexity of them might be beyond the child, so they're just displaying stuff that kind of gives us a sense of something that would be needed if those emotions did truly exist. And the two discrete emotion behaviors that newborn infants display are what's called crying and smiling. I don't think I really need to provide definitions of these. You kind of know what crying and smiling are before you get into this class. But I do want to point out that there are some nuances to these things that many people have studied when it comes to infants. One of the things that's been kind of unique and interesting is that there have been some that have argued that cries do actually happen in a variety of different forms. They've suggested that maybe we're all pre-programmed with what's called a basic cry, this rhythmic pattern of crying that gets us to those things that we need, almost like a reflexory thing, where if we're hungry or tired or maybe just burnt out where we've used up a lot of our energy, we immediately kick in on this cry to insist that we need sleep or a pacifier or food put into our mouth. But as we start to progress and start to display some of those circular reactions we talked about earlier, these cries might evolve. They might evolve into what's called an anger cry, where we feel like we've expressed what we need and aren't getting it, and this thing that we sometimes call a pain cry. It's also sometimes called a fear cry, where we recognize that something's wrong. Now, people have even tried to differentiate these in terms of the patterns of cries that pop up, where the anger cry is just significantly louder, even though the definition is more air is passed through the lungs, and the pain cry is paired with kind of a holding of breath to indicate this shock or surprise that kind of is overwhelming the child at the time. There is some evidence to suggest that these things do sort of exist, and there has been studies that have shown that parents tend to be able to differentiate the cries of their own children. The catch is that there's also some counter evidence to this. If you're just listening to a random child cry, it's almost impossible to differentiate between these things. And if parents don't know the context of the situation very well before they listen to the recording of their child cry, they struggle with being able to identify the exact cry that the child's displaying. It puts us in a gray zone. It suggests that crying is probably an innate thing, and maybe it starts to evolve when it starts to relate to specific emotions, but it's, with most things linked to infants, a complex story, and one that's kind of incomplete. The same thing can be said for the next topic that we talk about, smiling. Usually when we see newborn infants smile, we tend to melt. We tend to think of them showing happiness almost instantly at birth when they see, say, their parents for the first time or experience that first cuddle or whatever it is that produces that smile. But some of our more curmudgeon researchers have pointed out that there's a very good chance that these smiles that newborn infants are displaying are just what's called reflexive smiles, kind of uncontrolled responses of the mouth that are a byproduct of things like relieving pressure in the body or getting some type of basic need met without any intention of kind of displaying pleasure for the social world around them that they really don't understand. In fact, some have argued that something like a social smile doesn't actually develop for a couple months. And it's not until anticipation starts to kick in and the recognition of the social world and their ability to impact them that a smile really counts. You, much like the crying thing, can sort of determine how you feel about whether or not there are real smiles that are happening with newborn infants, but just understand this is pretty much all we have when it comes to emotions as infants. We got crying and smiling, and that persists for a number of months until we get a little bit older and certain things start to emerge as, well, our brains and our minds start to become more complex. As we transition into infancy and we start to look more like people and start to interact with the world, we start to see the emergence of what many researchers call our primary emotions. 6 basic emotions that seem to be intact throughout all of infancy after that kind of newborn moment where we just have the 2 reactions and seem to persist kind of both physiologically from infancy into childhood and beyond for pretty much everybody across all cultures. Essentially, we are looking at what many have argued is Goldberg's 6 discrete emotions. You might have seen these emotions before. If you're wondering what that list is reminding you of, You go back a few slides eventually to the faces that you saw when I was listing Goldberg's discrete emotion idea. You'll see that those individuals are displaying joy, anger, sadness, fear, surprise, and disgust. These are also the emotions that were depicted, minus surprise, because again, how the heck do you categorize surprise, that were highlighted in the movie Inside Out, something that we talked about earlier. These primary emotions, again, seem to emerge a couple months in after we've gone beyond just crying and smiling, and they seem to be the prevalent ones, or the kind of the most consistent ones in young infants for about a year of life. Once a year hits and we start to develop that sense of self, something that we talked about in the cognitive section, other emotions do start to follow in tow. Jealousy, pride, guilt, maybe even empathy, even though this is a little bit rare, tends to start to pop up in young children. You can actually see displays of what maybe are called empathy in the two children on the bottom in this picture to the right. And you can see a very clear display of jealousy in the child up on top, where it looks like his mother is cuddling a doll. Jealousy is one that's very easy to pick up on many children around age 1, and a lot of these other ones do start to follow in tow as children start to recognize the social world around them. What we also see is that as these self-conscious emotions start to pop up, emotional attachments, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next class, do start to become much, much more prevalent. And individual attachment types, which again we're going to be talking about in the next class, do seem to emerge. Essentially, it seems as though we need those more complex emotions, being for those topics of attachment and something else we'll talk about later called temperament, start to be recognized. But even though when we get to about 2 years of age and are transitioning into childhood, we've got a lot more going for us from where we were when we were born, there are lots of limitations to our emotional range in infancy. We, first of all, are not very good at expressing many emotions beyond sadness and happiness, even by the time we're 2. If any of you question that, please feel free to hang out with a 2-year-old and recognize how frustrating it can be to figure out what the heck a child wants, because the child can't often express their emotions that well. They also can't recognize the emotions they're feeling oftentimes, which leads to even more frustration. And then the kicker is that they usually can't recognize that you're not real thrilled with the fact that they can't recognize what they're feeling right now. Now, these are the 3 big issues when it comes to kind of the social problems with emotions. But if we're talking about the kind of internal struggles that these children are also having, it's the fact that once an emotion hits, they are kind of at the whim of their emotions. There's almost no ability for infants to control the emotions once they arise, no ability to control their behaviors that usually stem from these emotions, and no ability to recognize that there are consequences when they do some of the things that they do when they're feeling an emotion that they can't even themselves recognize. Essentially, it really speaks to why that wonderful term, the terrible twos, should actually be called something around the terrible 1 to 1.5s that lasts until around 3 or 4s, because this limitation in emotional strength that lots of kids need to develop can be extremely frustrating for pretty much everybody involved. It's not that these kids aren't cute and that they're not forming attachments and that these emotions aren't necessary. It's just where they're at in the developmental process when it comes to emotions can be challenging for everybody, including the infants, well, the soon to be children themselves. When we get into childhood, though, what we do start to see is that emotions start to spread out, become much more complex, even if kids are still struggling with certain things. When we really start to see lots of individual differences emerge. At this point, kids do start to display specific types of emotions more often and kind of tap into those emotions. You might, when you see a child, see them start to ham it up, where they start to display specific emotions when they recognize that it's probably appropriate to display those in the situations, or they might get something out of that situation if they do display a specific type of emotion. This also relates to their ability to finally start picking up on the emotions that others are feeling. Usually it starts with their ability to recognize the emotions of their parents or primary caregivers, and it also transitions to them being able to slightly better recognize the emotions of their peers, which can definitely help with interactions with others and can start to really create a little bit better bonds that these children were incapable of really having with other children until this point. There is the ability, to an extent, to control emotions and control emotional reactions, but it's really important to note here that most kids aren't great at this. And there's also a huge amount of variability when we transition from early childhood to middle childhood in terms of kids' ability to really tap into their emotions and kind of subdue the ones that they decide are not desirable at the time. One of the classic examples of this variation from person to person was actually displayed in a study run by a very famous social psychologist named Walter Mischel, who was very interested in studying something called delay of gratification. In this study, which you might have heard of before, it's often called the marshmallow study, he asked 4 and 5-year-old children to sit in front of a marshmallow for an extended period of time while he left a room and recorded them. And if they could resist that marshmallow, not eat it while he was gone, he told them they could get a second one in addition to the one that was sitting in front of them. But if they couldn't resist, it would be okay. They just get that one marshmallow and no second one. And what Michelle was able to show, and you're going to see a video on this a little bit later, was that there was a great degree of variability from child to child. Not only did he find that interesting, but the types of responses they gave and some of the things that he was able to tie with this variability was really eye-opening to lots of emotion researchers and people who studied kind of educational abilities of adults. It really showed the needs to develop some of these early childhood emotional skills like delaying gratification. And it also gave us insights as to how environments, even at our young ages, could dramatically impact the types of emotions that we were expressing and our emotional abilities. There's been numerous studies that have shown that stressors in the environment, parental neglect, lots of different issues with respect to kind of family dynamics, it have a really big impact on the emotional skills of kids, even as young as 2, 3, and 4 years of age. And it's not that these things pop up just randomly for a short period of time. What Michelle's research and lots of other individuals' research was able to show is that this persists when it happens throughout much of our lifespan. So I encourage you to watch the video link that I've provided so you can get more information on this really interesting moment in life when emotions do start to blossom and create lots of individual differences. As we get into adolescence, we do start to see, for most people, the vast majority of the population, a huge uptick in emotional capability. Even if there were kind of some stunting in terms of emotional growth for most of us, by the time we get into adolescence, our brain is chugging away, our amygdala is growing super large, and we are usually capable of displaying much greater emotional range. So it's not that we're really happy or really sad. We can talk about being mildly happy or mildly sad or moderately sad. Essentially, we can start to talk about levels of severity of the variety of different emotions that we can actually feel. And we also see from this that it tends to increase in our changes in the brain that lead to more negative emotions. Again, the amygdala tends to be tied to things like sadness. And we see other factors that also can create this increased in negative emotions. If you remember back to your adolescence, you probably remember puberty and school and all those wonderful things that tend to be very dramatic and tend to cause us to be a little bit more upset at times. It's probably important to note that as a whole, kids aren't just super mopey when they're teenagers. It's just they're on this constant roller coaster when it comes to emotions. But it allows us, when we're going through this, to also start to really tap into our own emotions, feel what we're feeling, and recognize the emotions of others, and maybe even recognize that some of the things we're doing with respect to our emotions have consequences. Important fact with this, though, is that even though we're starting to tap into that, because the upper cognitive areas of our brain aren't quite developing in adolescence. We've talked about this before, the lack of development of the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex until really our late adolescence, early adulthood. What we tend to see is that even though kids can recognize, man, I shouldn't do this, even though I'm feeling this emotion, they still do things nonetheless. And if they recognize they're feeling an emotion, it's very tough for them to change that emotional state or subdue that emotion that they're feeling. It's kind of this wonderful concoction for a lot of chaos. Essentially, we become balls of emotions and recognize that these balls of emotions that we are not necessarily that desirable in certain situations, but we can't control it nonetheless until long after, and then we tend to be very regretful about this. It's tough to overcome. Even the best of us struggle with this at times during adolescence, but again, there are some pretty dramatic degrees of variability from person to person in terms of kind of our emotional skills by the time we transition into adolescence. And this continues into once we get into adulthood, we essentially reach our own kind of emotional intelligence peak. Now, much like IQ, it's a little tough to talk about reaching a peak when we're talking about a measure of intelligence that we compare across peoples, not across age. But what we tend to see is that for most of us, we get a little bit better in our early adulthood years at recognizing our emotions, recognizing the impact that our emotions are having on us, being able to tap into those emotions and even potentially changing them across different situations. This also leads us to finally being able to really harness our emotions in some of the effective ways that researchers often talk about when discussing all the amazing things that come with emotions, where we can do away with those Dr. Spock ideas that having no emotions is the best option. One of the things that we tend to see is that people, once they get into their 20s and 30s, start to feel better and better, report more and more positive emotions throughout their day, at least in percentages of their day, and fewer negative emotions. And why is this the case? Well, it's an interesting question. What we tend to see is that as we are allowed to do more things we want, we tend to feel better and have more positive emotions. But that doesn't always mean that we're doing things that end great for us when we're in adolescence. So in adolescence, we get that freedom, but we sometimes first start tripping over our own feet and creating situations that could trigger more negative emotions. As we get into our 30s, 40s, and beyond, we start to get a little bit more attuned to what makes us happy and what's also going to keep us on a path that's not going to make us sad and cause negative emotions overall. And this relates to something that we call the socio-emotional selectivity theory. It highlights that when we get older, we tend to be happier, not just because great things are happening to us, but because we're creating a better network and we're pursuing things that we like more, and we've decided we can avoid certain things that don't make us happy. Essentially, think of it as us realizing that that person that's really cool that we'd love to hang out with, that makes us feel horrible about ourselves, tends to be somebody we don't like to hang out with as much when we get a little bit older. And that, in result, tends to make us just feel better, even if we can't quite understand why. It's a very impactful thing that suggests that, much like some of the latter cognitive topics we discussed, emotions tend to, usually for most of us, be on the rise throughout our entire lifetime. We get better at them, and we tend to pursue more positive things. Even there's a catch to this, though, and that's the fact that there can be some very abrupt turns that push us in the negative direction when we get into the latter years of our lives. Death of loved ones, death of family members, feeling like we're isolated, the financial strain that comes with older age, all of these things tend to be triggers for kind of a change into kind of emotional instability and kind of an increased uptick in sadness. This paired with sometimes the inability to do things that we want to do, or the inability to go places that we want to go, which creates lots of uncertainty and reliance on individuals, can definitely foster an uptick in negative emotions when we get into the much latter years of our lives. What's really interesting to note is that many individuals who undergo these things don't display this strong negative emotions that many researchers assume we all do display. And it suggests that there's probably multiple factors going on here. Social factors do seem to play a role in this emergence of negative emotions in the latter years of our life, but what we maybe have the ability to do based on individual difference is counter them in different ways and find other things, alternatives that can make us feel better. Essentially, it suggests that if you weren't happy throughout most of your life, these things can definitely tailspin you. If you're happy most of your life, you might be able to find ways to avoid it. But there's always caveats to this. If something is just completely catastrophic to somebody, no matter how happy they were, you could see a marked change in these individuals. It really highlights the fact that our social environment does really matter when it comes to emotions, not just in infancy, but throughout our entire life. I always would like to kind of end this topic on a slightly happier note, but this does actually mark the end of our topic of emotions. We're not quite done with this yet. We've got two other areas that we're going to explore in the next lecture that are very closely linked to the idea of emotions. In particular, we're going to be talking about the topics of temperament and attachment. So I encourage you to make sure you review this, and when you're ready, I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care.